Good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todos. I am Rafael Fernández de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego, and I'm very happy to co-organize this with Comexi. Welcome, Héctor Cárdenas, the president of Comexi. I believe we're here to have a very interesting webinar about trying to understand what is the meaning of this the Trump tariffs, what is the overall impact in the world, and of course in Mexico and in Canada. We have wonderful speakers, pero déjenme pasarle la palabra. Let me give the floor to Mariana Lopez to explain all of you how to listen to this either in English or in Spanish. Mariana Lopez, please, yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael. We will be offering simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish during this meeting. If you wish to hear the speakers in English or Spanish, please click the interpretation button at the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. You'll see a globe icon that will appear right after these instructions. If you're joining us via the Zoom smartphone app, select your language by clicking More or the three dots in the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. Select Language Interpretation, then choose English or Spanish and click Done. If you wish to hear only the interpreter and not the original speaker, be sure to click Mute Original Audio. We kindly suggest choosing the language of your preference. Do not stay in the default off, or you will not be able to listen participants who speak in the other language. Muy buenos días a todos. Estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea al inglés y español durante esta reunión. Si desea escuchar la interpretación en inglés o español, haga clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla Zoom. Verá un icono en forma de globo terráqueo que aparecerá después de estas instrucciones. Si nos acompaña a través de la aplicación Zoom para teléfono inteligente, seleccione su idioma haciendo clic en donde dice More o en los tres puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de la pantalla. Seleccione Interpretación del idioma, elija español o inglés y haga clic en donde dice Listo. Si desea escuchar solo al intérprete y no a los presentadores, asegúrese de hacer clic en donde dice Silenciar audio original. Le sugerimos elegir el idioma de su preferencia. No se quede en la posición predeterminada, ya que no podrá escuchar a los participantes que hablen en el otro idioma. Back to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Mariana. Let me give the floor to Héctor Cárdenas, president of Comexi, so he could introduce our panelists. Adelante, Héctor.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for the kind introduction. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this panel, and we have a fantastic panel today. I'm going to very briefly introduce everybody. I will not do full justice to your very extensive experience and expertise, but I will just introduce you in a brief way. We have Gabriela Siller Pegaza with us. Gabriela es directora de análisis económico en Grupo Financiero Base y profesora de economía en el Tecnológico de Monterrey. Y Gabriela tiene muchos años de estar trabajando en el análisis de la coyuntura económica, de los mercados financieros y la política monetaria. Colabora regularmente en diversos medios de comunicación especializados en México. Muchas gracias, Gabriela, por unirte a nuestro seminario de hoy. También me da mucho gusto. Gracias, Gabriela. Sí. También me da mucho gusto dar la bienvenida a Carlos Serrano, viejo amigo y colega de Berkeley. Es el economista en jefe de BBVA en México, y ahí dirige un equipo de economistas que analizan los más relevantes temas económicos, financieros y regulatorios de México. Y él obtuvo su maestría y doctorado de economía por la Universidad de California en Berkeley, el lugar donde nos conocemos de hace muchos años. Y además es licenciado en economía por el ITAM. Y Carlos también trabajó en la Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores como vicepresidente de política regulatoria. Entonces, realmente me da mucho gusto poder dar la bienvenida a Carlos, que es un gran especialista en estos temas. También me da mucho. I'm very happy now to introduce Andrea Durkin. Andrea serves as Vice President for International Policy for the National Association of Manufacturers, which is the association that brings together the main manufacturers in the United States, one of the most important trade associations in the United States. And she's one of the nation's foremost experts on international policy, And she draws from decades of experience serving in both Democratic and Republican administrations. She's worked in the USTR, especially with regards to WTO, U.S. policy in the WTO, on the Development Trade Committee, G7, and G20 trade tracks. So, Andrea, thank you very much for coming. Andrea's a great expert on everything related to trade. I also would like to welcome Sergio Gómez Lara. Sergio es el CEO del Consejo Coordinador Empresarial en Washington, D.C. Es decir, es la representación del Consejo Coordinador Empresarial de México en Washington. Y Sergio cuenta una amplísima trayectoria en temas de negociaciones comerciales internacionales, habiendo representado a México durante 9 años en este ámbito, donde desde puestos en la Secretaría de Comercio y Fomento Industrial y la Secretaría de Economía. Estuvo muy involucrado en las consejerías comerciales en la oficina del Telecan en Canadá y ante la Comunidad Europea, en donde integró el equipo negociador del TLQM, que es uno de los acuerdos más importantes que tiene México después del acuerdo con Estados Unidos y Canadá. Entonces me da gran placer darte la bienvenida, Sergio. Hay también un gran experto en temas comerciales que actualmente está al pie del cañón, como se dice en México, en Washington, D.C., viendo los temas de aranceles y de la política comercial del gobierno de Trump. Muchas gracias a todos y damos inicio, Rafael, con la primera pregunta.
Let me remind everybody, there's a Q&A button. If you want to send questions, if you want to interact with us, please do so. We will expect you to send a lot of questions and comments, and we want to do this as interactive as possible. Andrea, let me start with you. You're in Washington, D.C. Last week, I mean, there's been a week that Trump announced these huge tariffs that basically address the entire world. Could you tell us, how high are these tariffs? I mean, how surprising they were, and what is the rationale for the tariffs? And I will also ask all of you, what is the need for the U.S.? What is the U.S. trying to get out of these tariffs? Andrea, thank you for joining us, and yours is the floor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Héctor, for the kind introduction, and welcome to everybody. So there's a lot to unpack with this announcement. I think the first thing to understand about it is the authority that the president used to increase the tariffs, and that will become significant for a few reasons over time. And we're familiar with this tool now because it's called IEEPA. This is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It is predicated on an underlying national security authority. And it was already deployed by the president to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China earlier this year. And I mean, we're not that deep into the year. This was a couple months ago. And he used this authority again to deploy and to really reset our entire sort of the U.S. Global tariff rate system. And what he has, and it's important because, unlike the rationale that was used the first time with Canada, Mexico, China, regarding border issues, regarding fentanyl, this time the White House has cited lack of reciprocity in our bilateral trade relationships, that we have disparate tariff rates, but also non-tariff barriers, and that there are trading partner economic policies that have deleterious effects on, for example, U.S. manufacturing by suppressing domestic wages and consumption, for example. So it is a mix of, and that these result in persistent and large trade deficits. And this is important underlying rationale because it means with a lot of different reasons going into the tariffs, there may be a lot of different reasons and bases and decision-making around what enables you to negotiate them down from here. And so what the administration essentially announced was now a new global 10% tariff baseline. And that is on top of the existing MFN rates. So it's on top of whatever existing duties and fees there were. That might be countervailing duty orders, things like that. The 10% universal already went into effect on April 5th. But then, as we saw, as the president held up the poster with different countries, that they used a formulation across the board, figured out essentially who runs trade deficits and how to, instead of calculating, individual rates based on different complaints like currency manipulation and things like this, they basically looked at the amount of the trade deficit or trade surplus, divided it by imports into the United States by that country in 2024, came up with a percentage, and then took half of that percentage, and that becomes column 1, which is, I want to confuse it with the HS code, but essentially on their poster, that was what the administration decided and was the rate that other countries charge U.S. goods. And so the new U.S. rate on those countries would be half of that. And so now you've got on about 57 countries, very high and variable, depending on the country or the bloc, like the EU, a new rate. And that's how the administration determined those new rates. You find that in Annex 1 of the order. Those new rates will go into effect on April 9. So where are we now? Okay, we're at April 8th. So by midnight tonight, we'll have all of those new rates. CBP just issued guidance letting exporters, importers know how to fill out the forms in order to apply those rates. Now, we'll get to this in more detail, which I think is probably the point of the call, but Canada and Mexico were not on that poster. I think we were all looking to see where was Canada and Mexico, what would the president say about Canada and Mexico. He left that for the written word for the EO, and essentially mostly status quo. So what was in place before the April 2 announcement is what continues to be the case, which is if you've got qualifying goods under USMCA, you can continue to use USMCA, but non-qualifying goods would still have now a 25% IEEPA tariff applied to them. And there were some exceptions to that. But he stipulated in this executive order that should those previous IEEPA rates be suspended or terminated, it would go from 25 to 12. So not 0, but 12. So we've got now the need for massive spreadsheets to understand the tariff rates. And in some cases, these tariffs will stack on top of each other. And so my organization advocated for not stacking any of the 232 tariffs on top of these new reciprocals. They did that, and they have some exemptions. But again, these rates will apply to MFN, or in the case of Canada, Mexico, will apply, potentially to we already had sort of some stacking going on there. So it's complicated now. Where you have a 232 tariff on certain products, they're saying those would not stack. That's like steel, aluminum, derivatives, automotive parts, and that they would not apply for the moment to products. There's a product list, and that product list also corresponds in part with what we anticipate there will be new 232 rates on things like copper and lumber, pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. So importantly, one other thing I'll say before leaving it there for the conversation is that they are looking to apply this new tariff to the non-U.S. content. So if there was U.S. content in that import coming in, and this is probably very important for the North American relationship, provided at least 20% of the article has U.S. originating content, that U.S. content would not have the tariff applied. So clear as mud. That's what I can tell you in terms of the rundown of what was announced on April 2.
Thank you, Andrea. This is very clear. Carlos, tú has estudiado los aranceles. ¿Qué piensas tú qué intentó hacer Trump? ¿Cómo va a afectar a Estados Unidos y cómo está afectando al mundo, Carlos?
Cómo no, Rafa. Primero, agradezco mucho la invitación. Es un honor para mí estar en este panel de Comex y de UC San Diego con dos grandes amigos como son Héctor y Rafa, y un honor compartir el panel con Gaby, con Andrea y con Sergio. Primero, yo apuntaría, Rafa, estamos viendo el aumento de aranceles efectivos pues, más altos en un siglo. La tarifa, el arancel efectivo de Estados Unidos va a estar ahora más alto que el nivel que vimos en 1930 con la Smoot-Hawley Act, que creo que cualquier académico concluye que esos niveles de aranceles ayudaron a profundizar la recesión. En aquel momento el arancel efectivo se llevó a alrededor de 20%, ahora estará entre 23 o 24%, es decir, estamos, de permanecer estos aranceles, vamos a ver un nivel de proteccionismo mayor que el de 1930, que como ya decía yo, ayudó a profundizar la recesión. ¿Qué se pretende? Yo diría que estos aranceles, al parecer, provienen de una tesis que yo creo que es incorrecta. Y esa tesis, ya explicaba Andrea cómo se impusieron los aranceles, esa tesis parte de decir que un déficit comercial es algo malo y que cuando un país tiene un déficit comercial está en una peor situación y que además, así lo ha dicho el presidente Trump, está siendo abusado por los países con los que tienen un superávit. Y yo diría, primero, no hay ninguna evidencia que sugiera que esto sea el caso. Comparemos Japón con Estados Unidos. Desde los años 70, Estados Unidos ha tenido consistentemente déficits comerciales con el mundo y Japón ha tenido superávits comerciales con el mundo. Sin embargo, si comparamos cómo estábamos en los 70 a cómo estamos ahora, Estados Unidos ahora es más próspero, su PIB per cápita es 25% mayor, la diferencia respecto a la que teníamos en los 70. Entonces, pues no está muy claro que un país que tenga un déficit comercial esté siendo abusado, esté en una peor situación. En muchos casos, hay que recordar que un déficit comercial se explica porque un país tiene un nivel de ahorro menor al de la inversión que tiene, y en el caso de Estados Unidos es un polo de inversión por ser un país con mucho dinamismo, con mucha innovación, con confianza en su Estado de Derecho. Eso hace que atraigan inversiones que les permite financiar mayores importaciones. Entonces no creo que podamos concluir que un déficit sea algo negativo. Y el problema es que así se diseñaron los aranceles. Originalmente se había dicho que iba a haber aranceles recíprocos. Y creo que eso no hubiera estado del todo mal, porque lo que se decía es, bueno, vamos a ponerle el mismo arancel a los distintos países que el que enfrenta Estados Unidos. Y eso pudo haber creado un incentivo para que otros países bajaran sus aranceles y tuviéramos un mundo menos fragmentado. Pero al haberse diseñado utilizando el déficit comercial, como ya explicaba Andrea, pues creo que no se lanza ningún tipo de incentivo. Al contrario, pues un país no puede hacer mucho por disminuir el déficit porque se obedece otra vez a desequilibrios económicos. Entonces me parece que estamos ante una situación donde vamos a ver un menor crecimiento de la economía mundial. Trump dice, Rafa, que lo que se pretende es que haya más inversión en Estados Unidos y que haya más empleos. Lo del empleo creo que es difícil de entender porque hoy la economía de Estados Unidos está en pleno empleo. De hecho, creo que es difícil pensar que van a poder obtener más empleo para las inversiones que se pretenden. Y segundo, creo que es difícil también pensar que vamos a ver un boom en la inversión en Estados Unidos con estos aranceles, porque lo que estamos viendo es una enorme incertidumbre. Imagínense a alguien que está pensando en hacer una planta automotriz. Si empezara a construirla el día de mañana, cosa que es muy difícil porque hay que ubicar los terrenos, tener los permisos, pero si empezara mañana, podría empezar a vender autos en 3 años. Y en 3 años, pues estaremos ya hacia el final de la administración Trump. No estará muy claro que estos aranceles vayan a permanecer. Entonces tampoco me queda claro que vayamos a ver esa oleada de inversión, porque además, como ya decía, ni siquiera está claro que si se llegara a dar esa inversión, se podrían conseguir los trabajadores para tenerla. Creo, Rafa, que lo que vamos a ver en Estados Unidos es menor crecimiento. La mayoría de los analistas ya han rebajado sus pronósticos, un mayor nivel de precios, y si esto dura, pues va a ser una economía menos competitiva. ¿Por qué? Porque esto puede lograr que el capital fluya de sectores donde Estados Unidos es muy productivo, en servicios, en inteligencia artificial, servicios financieros, etcétera, a sectores donde lo es menos, como por ejemplo la producción automotriz o algunas otras producciones manufactureras, y eso puede afectar la competitividad de Estados Unidos. Y creo que en este sentido, pues la reacción de los mercados fue muy clara. Vimos la cuarta peor corrección en los mercados en los últimos 3 días. La última vez que habíamos visto correcciones de este tipo fue en la pandemia y en la crisis financiera global, con la diferencia que me parece que ahora esto es un daño autoinfligido. Entonces yo creo que de permanecer estas aranceles, pues me parece que vamos a ver un menor crecimiento de la economía global y un menor crecimiento de la economía de Estados Unidos.
Gracias, Carlos. Les insisto a todos, hay ahí un botón de preguntas y respuestas. Mándenos sus preguntas, send us your questions, your comments, and there's a button to do that. Héctor, creo que Andrea y Carlos ya nos pusieron el panorama general bastante claro. Entonces, ¿por qué no le vamos entrando a la pregunta sobre México y América del Norte? ¿Te parece, Héctor?
Absolutamente, me parece muy bien.
Gabriela, ¿por qué? O sea, esquivó la bala México, platícanos cómo está y luego caemos contigo, Sergio, que tienes la precisión, pues estás ahí en Washington. Adelante, Gabriela, por favor.
Buenos días a todos, muchas gracias por la invitación, es un honor para mí estar aquí. Respondiendo así expresamente a la pregunta, no, México no ha esquivado la bala de los aranceles, tan es así que todavía están los aranceles adicionales sobre el acero y el aluminio, y muy importante, los aranceles de la industria automotriz que tienen el potencial de dañar un montón a la economía mexicana, y además también los aranceles que entraron en vigor el 4 de marzo, de los que se ha exentado los bienes que se exportan de México a Estados Unidos bajo el TEMEC, que no es poca cosa, es casi el 52% de las exportaciones mexicanas. Y bueno, escuchando también a Andrea y a Carlos, pues estaba pensando que en el primer mandato de Trump, en la campaña, Trump había amenazado con imponer aranceles del 30% a las importaciones que llegaban desde México. No lo realizó, y entonces esta vez también, cuando amenaza con imponer aranceles, pues en México creo que la mayoría pensábamos que no iba a ser capaz, sobre todo por el daño que iba a provocar sobre la economía de Estados Unidos, no pensando en México, sino este daño que explicaba hace rato Carlos. Y resulta que sí. Entonces esto ha sido como una sorpresa que obviamente ha afectado al tipo de cambio en México, que ha generado una mayor incertidumbre, y con la incertidumbre tú sabes pues que siempre vienen frenos en los proyectos de inversión, y México además pues venía de una marcada desaceleración económica en el 2024, y con estos aranceles y amenazas que no sabemos cómo van a quedar al final, pues estos aranceles, pues la economía mexicana es muy posible que ya estemos en una recesión. Entonces, no los hemos esquivado. Yo creo, para cómo se ve ahorita la narrativa de Trump y su equipo de asesores, es que los aranceles van a permanecer. Aquí para México, lo relevante va a ser la posición relativa que tenga respecto al resto del mundo. Me explico, en el primer mandato de Trump, pues también hubo una gran narrativa proteccionista, inició una guerra comercial con China, de la cual México terminó viéndose beneficiado, porque México es ahora el principal proveedor de importaciones desde Estados Unidos. De los 7 puntos porcentuales que perdió China en la participación de las importaciones de Estados Unidos, México ganó alrededor de 2 puntos porcentuales. Fue el segundo país que más se benefició, después de Vietnam, que ganó un poco más de 2 puntos porcentuales. Entonces ahora, si permanecen los aranceles con el resto del mundo, pero México, aunque tenga aranceles, pero menores, pues entonces, así como ganamos participación de mercado con el proteccionismo, con la guerra comercial con China, pues ahora también se podría ganar participación de mercado. Esto obviamente no se vería en el corto plazo, sino sería en el mediano y en el largo plazo, pero pensando ganar participación de mercado sobre un pastel más chico, porque si estos aranceles de Trump tienen el potencial de generar una desaceleración de perdido en la economía global o recesión, pues entonces estamos hablando de un pastel más chico y que seguramente será más competitivo, y además un mundo más incierto, y creo que inclusive más regionalizado también. Entonces, no hemos esquivado los aranceles, creo que esto no ha terminado, veremos todavía, pues no creo que días, creo que serán meses de incertidumbre. Creo que todo el 2024 seguiremos escuchando de aranceles, o también de cómo responden algunos países, de cómo responde Trump, y todo esto seguirá generando incertidumbre sobre el comercio internacional.
Gabriela, si te puedo hacer una pregunta de follow-up. Uno de los argumentos que he escuchado es, por lo menos con esta medida no se explotó el Temec. Es decir, se mantuvo el Temec, se respetaron los derechos adquiridos bajo el Temec, por lo menos hasta cierto punto. ¿Es cierto eso o todavía está en peligro el Temec desde tu punto de vista?
Yo no creo que esté en peligro el TEMEC, tan es así que Trump hizo exenciones a los bienes que se exportan desde México y Canadá hacia Estados Unidos con el TEMEC. Y creo que lo que está buscando ahí es que pues haya una mayor integración comercial. Y bueno, como ustedes saben, pues tanto México como Canadá podía exportar a Estados Unidos utilizando el Tratado de Libre Comercio, pero también utilizando el principio de nación más favorecida. En el caso de lo que se enviaba de México a Estados Unidos fuera del TEMEC, o sea, utilizando el principio de nación más favorecida, pues había un arancel promedio del 3%, que a lo mejor funcionaban como incentivos perversos, y entonces, pues las empresas, ¿para qué se metían en líos de tener que cumplir con todos los requerimientos del tratado, que al cabo tenían que pagar un arancel del 3%? Ahora no, ese arancel es del 25%, y entonces sí o sí, pues las empresas les conviene subirse a los requerimientos del tratado. Entonces creo que más bien es un incentivo para que más empresas y productos se suban para cumplir con los requerimientos del tratado. Lo que sí, y no sé si me estoy adelantando con esto, creo que no, que Trump no va a querer solamente una revisión del tratado, sino una revisión, una renegociación completa.
Gracias, Gabriela. Sergio, tú tienes la película completa. ¿Cómo queda México con todo esto?
Sí, bueno, mira, el resumen de cómo queda México es, si me permití compartir. Oh, sorry, I'm going to speak in English because my slide is in Spanish. So,
Good.
well, how Mexico comes out of this? Well, first of all, I would say 45% of our exports are in.
Estaba mejor la otra manera de presentar el slide. Lo veíamos todo completo. Si regresamos al anterior, Alejandra.
Laura, si lo pones como estaba, por favor. So what I would say is that, and the slide is coming in a minute, 45% of our exports are with tariffs. So unfortunately, I will have to disagree with Gabriela in the sense that the USMCA is safe. I unfortunately don't think so, because 45 of our exports, including USMCA exports, are with tariffs. So let me give you a brief summary of where we are. It is true that Mexico and Canada were the only FTA partners of the US that were not included in the April 2nd announcement. And that was interesting. North America was the only region that was respected in the terms of having an FTA on that speech. Not even partners, strategic partners such as Israel or South Korea had their FTAs recognized. And this is important. But unfortunately, the explanation of this is also that Mexico and Canada already had their tariffs on, and tariffs that violate directly the USMCA. So let me start with those. So tariffs against USMCA product. First violation of the USMCA, huge violation. 25 tariffs for autos and auto parts. And the only exemption for that tariff when it is a USMCA product is US content. So flatland violation of the basic concept of the USMCA, which is regional integration. Here, regional integration is destroyed, and there we're talking only about US content being recognized as qualifying for preferential. Then another violation of the USMCA, we have tariffs for steel, aluminum, and very important, what the US considers derivatives or manufacturers of steel and aluminum. So just to give you an idea of how big this is, President Trump, in his first term, he imposed tariffs for steel and aluminum. And those tariffs affected $5 billion of Mexican exports. Those tariffs disappeared when Mexico concluded the USMCA. This time, these tariffs include manufacturers of steel and aluminum. So instead of affecting 5 billion of Mexican exports, now they affect 35 billion of Mexican exports. So, and there is a pending investigation on copper. So all this is USMCA products. This is USMCA compliant products. And this is 45% of our exports, more or less. Then we have tariffs for goods that do not comply with USMCA. And then the tariffs today is 25%. This will evolve when President Trump considers that Mexico and Canada have made enough progress in fentanyl and migration. This would evolve to a 12% tariff, which is the reciprocal tariff that Andrea mentioned. But as of now, it's a 25% tariff. So where does this, the question was, Héctor and Rafael, where does Mexico stand? Well, for products that comply with USMCA, we have 25% tariff for cars and auto parts, only exemption for US content. Mexican content is not considered, and 25% tariff for steel, aluminum, and manufacturers of steel and aluminum. And we have, for goods that do not comply with USMCA, we have over 50% tariff for cars, and we have 50% tariff for steel, aluminum, and derivatives. And for the rest of the goods, we have a 25% tariff. So if you look at this, we are not pretty well compared to the rest of the world. If you make the average, and I will end my comment with this, if you make an average weighted duty that Mexico faces today, in a positive scenario, considering that a lot of goods comply with the rule of origin, we will have a tariff that goes between 10 and 9%. Average, including everything. Preferential goods and non-preferential. This is basically the tariff that Brazil was given. So there is where we are, Rafael and Héctor.
Thank you, Sergio. This is very clear. Héctor, there's quite a few questions and comments there. Could you fit us some of them?
Yeah, I thought it would be good to. There's a question from one of our audience here, and I think maybe Andrea, you could answer this. Alfredo Beaumont is asking, could you draw 3 scenarios for tariff terms, short, medium, or long term, mentioning probability, effects in North America, and the effects in the North American area? So basically, do you have a sense of what's the likelihood that these tariffs that are being imposed on Mexico, for example, are only short term, medium term, or long term? Because that from what we just heard from Sergio makes a big difference because of the size of this tariffing.
I wish I knew the answer. All of us wish we knew the answer because, the complexity is one thing. And I think everybody has adequately described the layering and the complexity and how challenging on a day-to-day basis it is for companies to understand how to comply with this. And so many of them are now, Gabriela is right. I can see in my member companies, we have 14,000 members, manufacturers in the United States, many of whom, including the small and medium manufacturers, are deeply intertwined with suppliers and producers in Canada and Mexico. And in many cases, don't have a domestic alternative for those things. And And even if they did, I mean, to your question, I think what they're concerned about and worried about is, what moves do I make next? Do I make changes in my supply chain? Can I make investment decisions? I mean, the uncertainty is having a serious chilling effect on their ability to make decisions and to expand manufacturing in the U.S., which is what the Trump administration has said is the goal of this whole tariff initiative. And so the timing of it matters, and the question is the right one. But the key here is, I mean, if we were just talking about tariffs, I mean, Sergio is a former negotiator. I was a former negotiator. If you were just talking about tariffs, that's complicated. But let's say you decided, well, that what's in the offing is 0 for 0, everybody, 0. If that were the goal, well, you know what the goal is. It's a kind of a binary decision at that point. But they've also included an emphasis on non-tariff barriers. Now, we all know that's a very wide range of issues, and they're very hard issues. My office at USTR contributed to a lot of that report over the years. It's cumulative. It's got some straightforward issues. It's got some very complex issues like the EU's CBAM and deforestation regulation. And if that's what needs to be negotiated as part of reducing the tariffs reciprocally, then this could be months, this could be years, because those are very difficult things for governments to make commitments around, and have a lot of their own domestic politics around them. And it's not to say that they aren't legitimate non-tariff barriers. I would say they are, a lot of them, but and could the business community come out on the other side of this, better off? Maybe the world would be better off if some of these NTBs are addressed, perhaps. But they will take time. And if you bind them up with the tariff negotiations, well, now you're maybe not talking about, short-term outcomes.
So perhaps another question that's really quite related to this, Mariana Garay asks us, so do you foresee, given that this might be a longer term issue, these tariffs, do you foresee a change of supply chain manufacturing vocation? So especially in terms of the USMCA's preferential treatment, at least for everything except aluminum, steel, and cars, which is what Sergio just talked about. But in other sectors, there is a preferential treatment for USMCA. Is that going to change the way that manufacturers integrate their supply chains? Are we going to see a shift towards other specific industries? What is your expectation?
Is this for Andrea?
Yeah, for Andrea, yes. Andrea.
Sorry, I thought you said Gabriela, so I was just sitting around waiting for Gabriela's smart response on this. I think companies are very much, I mean, they're looking at alternatives, but where do you go? Because now we've got sort of the global tariff board reset. And they I think to the last question, they don't really know how long this will last. And because, as I said, the president has used this tool, this statute that allows him to make decisions quickly, without process, without consultations, then the question is, do I have a prospect of some tariffs going down? Are some going to go up if countries retaliate? Because we've seen with China that is about to happen. So no big moves at the moment, I think, is kind of how companies perceive this. If they had investments that were in the works, they are rolling them out. You can see that. There are companies that will for sure be looking to expand investment in the United States, no matter what the outcome is here, because, I mean, the president's policies are kind of all pointing in that direction. And I will say that there are a lot of policy proposals through the Congress, through the administration, that would be wildly beneficial to expanding manufacturing in the United States, extending the 2017 tax rates, and regulatory reforms, unlocking permitting so that there can be more investments in long-term manufacturing plays like mining and that sort of thing. Those are all big positives, and those in and of themselves could attract a lot of investment into the United States and an altering of supply chains. And the tariffs are still largely a wild card. But the last thing I'll say is that our companies are deeply invested in these relationships, particularly in North America. And 70% of what we bring in from Canada goes into more manufacturing in the United States. That number is 60% from Mexico. And so these relationships actually support manufacturing in the United States, and we will continue to make the case for that. And for that reason, I think we'll be really pushing to make sure that the administration at the end of all this negotiation has somehow strengthened this relationship, because it makes us more competitive, not just globally, but if you've got concerns about China's trade practices, the best way to counter that is to kind of lock arms in North America. And so, let's see if the relationship at the end of this isn't improved in some meaningful ways. But, as Sergio said, there's a very, very big hole in USMCA right now.
Carlos,
Thank you, Andrea.
to follow
Adelante,
up, yeah, Carlos, to follow up with you, do you see any of this sort of helping Mexican manufacturing in other areas apart from the ones that Sergio mentioned that are very hard hit? Do you see a rebalancing of our manufacturing base in Mexico based on these issues? Is Mexico more competitive relatively to other nations at this point? You're muted.
Sorry. Well, I think that Mexico eventually will come out more competitive against most other countries, in particular China. I think in the short term, Mexico will also suffer. First, we will have a lot of uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, as everyone has mentioned, investment suffers. And second, as Gabriela was saying, I think the US economy is going to decelerate sharply, maybe might go into a recession, and then that means that Mexico will be affected. That said, I will mention what I think comes clear from the actions enacted the last week is that the level of protectionism against Mexico and Canada is going to be lower than the rest of the world. And I think in the medium term, that places Mexico in a good position to eventually capture more of more investments. Now, I will mention two things, Héctor. I think this will not happen magically. Mexico needs to do some things. First of all, I agree with Sergio. What we saw are clear violations of USMCA, no question about it. Hopefully, that will eventually help to lift the tariffs on the auto sector and steel and aluminum. Even by acknowledging that is a huge violation of USMCA, I still think Mexico has to do everything in its power to keep USMCA, because at the end of the day, it can be a powerful instrument to attract investment once these policies go away. And I think eventually will go away. Quoting Churchill, the US always does the right thing after trying everything else. I think eventually it will become evident that these policies are not helping the US. And when they are rejected, I don't know if that's going to be in 1 month or in 4 years, USMCA can be a powerful instrument. That being said, Mexico, I think, needs to do 2 or 3 things to take advantage of this opportunity that you're mentioning. The first one is, yes, this is a violation of USMCA, but Mexico is also violating USMCA. For example, in energy policy, we're seeing a very clear violation. So first thing, Mexico should try to do away with all those violations in order to have a more powerful voice and argument for the US not to violate on these issues, the agreement. Second, Mexico enacted a reform to its judicial system that is creating significant uncertainty, that is sending the signal that the judiciary will no longer be independent in Mexico. That will result in Mexico not taking full advantage of these opportunities that I think in the medium term will be there. So eventually, I think Mexico will need to try to revert some or all of the damage that is being done. And finally, as everyone has mentioned here, an important chunk, around half of what Mexico exports to the US, goes not through USMCA. In some cases, it's going to be easy to just go through the bureaucratic process and go through USMCA, but in others not, because Mexico does not fulfill well the rule of origins. To my mind, Mexican industrial policy should be focused now in increasing value added in Mexican production so that a maximum possible of exports go through USMCA. And for that, the government will need to enact policies to connect providers with export firms in order to achieve this goal. But if the country works along these lines, I'm pessimistic in the short term with what we are seeing, but I'm optimistic in the medium term that eventually North America will come out as a more integrated region than what it is now.
Sergio, and maybe then Gabriela. Sergio, do you share Carlos's long-term optimism, or do you think that the future of the USMCA is really in danger at this point, and that we could have a greater breakdown of the rules than we've seen up to now?
And Héctor, let me add to that, because we only have 10 minutes to go. So Sergio, what else, and Gabriela, what else Mexico could do? And so what should be the strategy now? We know that Marcelo Ebrard is again in Washington. He's negotiating. What is he negotiating? What is he up to there? And what do you think that Mexico position should be on this? Sergio, and then we go to you, Gabriela, and then we'll have Andrea and Carlos to give us your final thoughts. Adelante, Sergio.
All right, so let me start with this comment that you made. Question, Rafa, what is the agenda? What are we negotiating? To finalize with Héctor. Héctor, I am pessimistic in the sense that I like this definition of pessimism, that a pessimist is a well-informed optimist. And with that comment, Laura, can we put the agenda, please, very quickly? This is the agenda that Mexico has in the US. Four areas. Number one, obviously, we need to work. This is a process. This is a negotiation. So we will fight to get those 232 measures on cars and steel and aluminum out, exempted for that. That is our first fight. We need to convince the Trump administration that we are part of the solution, not part of the problem. We need to convince them that America first does not mean America alone. And we need to use this opportunity where they have now a war against all the world. The markets are crushed. 62% of US adults are invested in actions. They all are seeing their investment decrease significantly. So there's a lot of pressure today to the US administration to move away from this. Biden lost the election on inflation. And there is an election, as you know, in the next summer. Not this one, but 2026. So we need, number one, to negotiate, and that is what Marcelo Ebrard and Luis Rosendo are working on, negotiate an exception on 232 for goods that comply with the USMCA, not only US content, but for all goods that comply with the USMCA. Secondly, we need to get away from the 25 fentanyl tariff. We will move to a 12% MFN tariff, but we need to be better than the rest of the world because we are a USMCA partner. Third negotiation is China and the North American perimeter. We are discussing how are we going to play the China rule. And there is a discussion if we need to have the same time of barriers towards China in North America, Canada and Mexico. This is a very complex discussion because there are some inputs, I was talking to Rafael this morning, that are only made in China on electronics. And if we close the border from one day to another, we might get into trouble. So So we are agreeing with the US into harmonizing our approach to China. I think we should do that, but we need to look at it carefully with some specific exemptions. And 4, Mexican barriers to US exporters and investors. Carlos mentioned energy and others. So there is, and Andrea, in her comment, she explained that this is a very complex discussion. This is not only tariffs. So also on the table we have the measures that Carlos indicated that Mexico violates the USMCA. So this is our agenda. Rafael, this is what Marcelo and Luis Rosendo are discussing in Washington. And I am optimistic, Héctor, that if we come out with a good position of this negotiation, North America could be competitive again. But we need to take cars, steel, and aluminum out of the 232 because that is 45% of our exports today. And car is the most successful example of integration in North America. So we need to get those out in order to achieve and give credibility again to a USMCA that is in danger. Thank you.
Adelante, Gabriela.
Sí, claro. Yo creo que México tiene que hacer 3 cosas aquí. 1, negociar para bajar o eliminar los aranceles que están actualmente en vigor del sector automotriz. Esto incluye al 15% de las exportaciones que México envía hacia Estados Unidos. Además, el sector automotriz es un sector clave para México, no solamente por las exportaciones, sino por la inversión extranjera directa que llega a México de ese sector y las implicaciones o el efecto dominó que hay también sobre otros sectores, es decir, los proveedores de estos exportadores, los proveedores de los proveedores, sector servicios y demás. Y bueno, pues si estos aranceles permanecen, si se falla ahí en esas negociaciones, pues la verdad es que la recesión en México no será solamente leve, sino podría ser una recesión moderada o fuerte. 2, ayudar a las empresas a cumplir con los criterios del TEMEC. Hace ratito, pues se platicó que solamente el 48% de las exportaciones que México envía hacia Estados Unidos cumple con los criterios del tratado. Y si hay una exención para estos bienes que se envían bajo los criterios del tratado, pues entonces ahí convendría que el gobierno ayudara a que rápidamente las empresas puedan cumplir con estos criterios, que seguramente ya hay algunas, sobre todo en el sector automotriz, por este régimen de transición que vence no me acuerdo si en junio o julio de este año, que ya estaban, yo creo que más que preparadas, ¿no? Pero ahí, bueno, habrá que ayudarlas para que haya un mayor porcentaje, que yo me imagino que también por eso Trump a veces dice que México y Canadá han hecho trampa, a lo mejor se está refiriendo a estos bajos porcentajes de exportaciones que se envían bajo el tratado, y no es hacer trampa, no simplemente es la forma como se podía exportar a Estados Unidos. Y finalmente prepararse para la revisión o renegociación del TEMEC, que creo que va a ser no creo que vaya a ser una revisión, yo creo que va a ser una renegociación, si no es que Trump quiera hacer un nuevo tratado, así como lo hizo con el Telecán, que bueno, era de esperarse que quisiera su propio tratado, y como quiera con el TEMEC, pues ha dicho que es un mal tratado. Y entonces, pues es posible que quiera hacer uno nuevo, dándole continuidad como quiera al TEMEC. Y en este punto, en la revisión, renegociación o un nuevo tratado, bueno, pues seguramente se va a endurecer el contenido regional, sobre todo en industrias clave como la automotriz, entonces hay que estar preparados con eso. Creo que también se va a tratar la relación comercial que tiene México con China, porque se han incrementado mucho las importaciones que México ha hecho desde China, y me parece que parte de los propósitos o de los objetivos que tiene Trump con estos aranceles es aislar a China y no dejar que en algún momento sea la economía más grande de todo el mundo, y entonces pues si México le compra un montón de mercancía a China, pues como que parece que no estamos haciendo equipo con Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y el tema de energía, que ya mencionaron hace rato, que creo que esto da para un panel completo, y los otros puntos también, pero sobre todo que pues está abierta todavía una controversia comercial en contra de México, que no se ha elevado a fase de panel, y en caso de elevarse a fase de panel y que el panel falle en contra de México, pues sería algo gravísimo por la importancia que este sector tiene.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Héctor, si te parece, Gabriela, le damos la palabra a Andrea, que se tiene que ir a una reunión al Congreso. That is important, Andrea. You have to go to Congress and hopefully you defend the U.S. interests as well as North American. and then Carlos.
Thank you so much, and what a pleasure.
Your last
What
words
a
and your
pleasure to
last
be on the
questions.
panel with everybody and for this stimulating discussion. We're going to be talking about this for weeks and months for sure. So this is the beginning of the conversation. I guess where I would leave it is, on thinking about all of the manufacturers in the United States that we represent. We share the president's goal of expanding manufacturing in the United States, and we have been successful in this North American model, and that has supported that industry to thrive in the United States and to expand. And we will continue to argue for good, beneficial, mutual terms under that arrangement. One of the ways forward, so we need to continue to focus on how we achieve the goal, but without minimizing the disruption, the severe disruption to the manufacturing industry. And we don't want to be increasing costs. We want to make it more cost efficient for us to produce here. And so on the tariff front, really what this is, I agree with Sergio's, policy proposals. We have other existing U.S. FTAs with other key trading partners, and those are already on reciprocal tariff terms. So if we can address some of the non-tariff barriers and get back to, positive terms with those partners, those would be some potential quick wins. Where we have non-reciprocal industrial tariffs on manufacturing trade, we can pursue 0 for 0 there as well. At the same time, in the meanwhile, as this is taking time, we need to try to find some ways to give relief from the tariffs. And Sergio has mentioned a few ways to try to do that smartly. There are a lot of inputs that we rely on for manufacturing, and some of which are not available in sufficient quantity or type in the United States. So we would like to see those become tariff-free or get a credit in some way for the tariffs on those inputs. And we'll be continuing to look for some, relief in a smart way that enables us to continue to keep the cost down as we expand in the United States. So, if this is the path forward, then that's the way we have to keep about it and try to get to a positive outcome through the negotiations.
Thank you,
So again,
Andrea.
thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Héctor, why don't you close the webinar? Thank you all, and the wonderful and back to you, Héctor, so you can close the webinar.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for participating today. It's a very, very hot topic, very interesting and provocative ideas today. I think we're going to have to probably have another one to talk about this a little bit later on as we see how things unfold. And of course, there are many, many questions that still are unanswered, including what's going to happen to the peso going forward, and what's going to happen with the legal challenges to some of this, which I just saw are also impending. So we'll have a lot more to talk about. I hope that you can join us all again in a few weeks when we hopefully we can reconvene this panel on this topic. Thank you.
Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you all for being here.